Well, good afternoon, everybody. Senator Corn and I are delighted to call this hearing to order. Before we hear from our witnesses, we have in the audience a number of folks from other countries that are here, including, I'm told, an ambassador or two or three from Uruguay. Anybody here from Uruguay? Raise your hand. And what is your name? Bienvenido. How are you? Yeah. And anyone from Peru? Peru. And what is, ¿cómo se llama? Ah, bienvenido. And well, I was just led a congressional delegation down to Guatemala a couple of months ago. And Senator Cornyn's been there, I know, any number of times. Anyone here from Guatemala? Okay, good. I'm sorry? Do you think because he knew I was going to introduce him? Okay. Well, let him, is it male or female? Male. There's a man from Guatemala who knows how to make an entrance. We just introduced him. We said, Bien, I was just in your country again about 2 months ago with bipartisan, bicameral congressional delegation. We're delighted you're able to join us today. And I'm told that we may have representatives here from embassies, maybe from El Salvador, the embassy here in the U.S. Anybody from good. And from Paraguay, anybody from Paraguay? Stand up, go ahead, stand up. Yeah. Okay, welcome, bienvenido. Nice to see you. Okay, well, let's go ahead and kick off our hearing, important hearing, and we're delighted to be able to do this together. But thank you. We thank our visitors for joining us. We also want to especially thank our witnesses for not just joining us, but for preparing for this hearing and preparing your testimony and your willingness to respond to our questions as well. And I especially want to thank our subcommittee's ranking member, Senator Cornyn, with whom I'm privileged to work on any number of issues together. One of the things we try to do is I think we subscribe to the notion that the bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. And we can't always agree on everything, but we try to find the middle more often than not. And it's a real privilege for me. Today, we've come here to better understand how we can foster trade and economic cooperation throughout the Western Hemisphere, an important subject. It's interesting, I'm going to mix metaphors here. We're talking about the Western Hemisphere. I'm going to share with you an African proverb, but one of my favorite African proverbs goes something like this. It's, if you want to go fast, travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. And I think that's good advice on all kinds of fronts, including this here today. But today we've got, I think, a real opportunity to go far and do it together. And how might that be? But by understanding how our trade partnerships are mutually beneficial and vital to the health of our global economy. We've already seen our regional partnerships help tackle shared challenges, including climate, including immigration, and including security issues. Our global economy is increasingly shaped by regional cooperation. That includes enhancing supply chain resiliency and nearshoring manufacturing. These are issues that I know we all agree on, no matter what your party affiliation may be. And one way to increase regional cooperation and secure our supply chain is by working with our trading partners to build a stronger and a more resilient Western Hemisphere as we move forward. Today, we can help our own economy while also helping our allies improve their economies. It's not a choice of doing one or the other. We can do both. Greater collaboration across the region will support economic growth and job creation for people looking for opportunity and stability in the workforce. On the heels of Mother's Day, thanks to my own mother, I've tried to live, my mother was a deeply religious woman. And I have tried to live my life by the golden rule. She's a big golden rule person. And treat other people the way you want to be treated. It actually turns out that's in every major religion of the world, which I didn't realize when I was your age, our witnesses. But and I suspect I'm not the only person in this room. I know a couple of them pretty well. I'm not the only person who was raised with that in the golden rule in mind. We have a shared interest. I think we have a moral obligation to help our partners have stability so that their children and families can be safe so they can have access to education and have a good shot at some hope for the future a future filled with opportunities. For years, I've focused on addressing the challenges that people face, and among other places, the Northern Triangle, which includes some of the folks in the room here today, but includes folks in El Salvador, people from Guatemala, and from Honduras. And earlier this year, as I mentioned earlier, I led a bipartisan, bicameral congressional delegation to Mexico, to Guatemala, and to Honduras. And there, in addition to meeting with the leaders of those countries, we saw firsthand the need for greater economic opportunity, stronger rule of law, more educational and workforce training opportunities, and policies that we can implement with our partners to stem the flow of migration. Our delegation met with government officials, with private sector leaders, and with other stakeholders across all three countries to listen, to learn, and to develop solutions together. And despite many of the challenges we witnessed, there's also, I think, a reason for some hope for them, and I think for us too. In Mexico, we heard about how the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, also known as USMCA, has provided certainty for businesses operating across North America, while also bolstering protections for workers and helping to protect the environment of our planet on which all of us live. And in Guatemala and Honduras, we saw how the significant private sector investments spurred by the Biden administration and by us are creating jobs, expanding access to capital for small businesses, and providing workforce training and education, and improving economic outcomes. We also saw the important role of the textile industry in creating jobs and opportunities throughout the region. And through visits to the U.S. State Department-funded programs like migrant children's shelters and like coffee exporters, the positive impact on the ground was clear. And despite these successes, the trip underscored that there is more work that we can do and ought to do, and more that they can do to support economic growth, security, and resilience throughout the region. Let me ask you just a show of hands. Our witnesses, a question of our witnesses. Have you ever been to a store called Home Depot? Raise your hand if you have. You ever been to a Home Depot? Yeah. Anybody in the audience, you can put your hands in. Anybody in the audience, including people from Central America, South America, been to a Home Depot in your country? Anybody? Yeah, a number of people. They have a saying at Home Depot, and it goes something like this: "You can do it, we can help." That's it. You can do it, we can help, and that is. Something that certainly has guided me. I'm pleased to have our witnesses here today. We're pleased to have our witnesses here today to share their insights into how policymakers can use trade and economic tools to achieve these goals, and ultimately to work with our allies to chart a strategic path forward that advances the interests of not just one region or one little piece of the region, but the entire hemisphere. The Biden administration has already taken a number of steps to promote greater cooperation across both North and South America. I think one of the examples, very good example, is one that's called Call to Action Initiative. Not well known by everybody in the country, but I think it's a positive, very positive effort. It's led by our Vice President, and is spurring literally billions, with a B, billions of dollars of private investments and creating meaningful economic opportunities in Central America, while helping to sustainably address the root causes of migration, including illegal migration. U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and Secretary of State Tony Blinken also recently launched a new form of economic collaboration across the region to increase supply chain resiliency, to expand sustainability rather, and inclusive trade practices, and to support our climate goals. Today, I'm eager, I think we are eager to hear from all of you, from our witnesses, about how we can use these initiatives to meaningfully engage with our allies to address the range of challenges facing the Western Hemisphere. Importantly, free trade agreements are one key to creating economic growth and resiliency in the region. And while the successful renegotiation of the USMCA, we now have a model for how we can bolster trade across the Western Hemisphere and maybe even across the globe. Throughout the example of USMCA, we have seen that it is possible to create market economic opportunities and to update our trade policies for a 21st century economy, including establishing strong and enforceable standards to protect workers and to protect our environment. And while it's not a perfect agreement, nothing's perfect, it gives us a roadmap for how we can use trade to boost economic growth and foster a nurturing environment for job creation in our country and in the country of our trading partners. Toward that end, I hope we can consider opportunities to modernize and strengthen some of the other trade deals throughout our region, including the Central America Free Trade Agreement and some of the bilateral agreements and investment frameworks throughout Latin America. Another major economic and security consideration for the Western Hemisphere is China's footprint in the region, especially when their actions run counter to the strategic goals of the United States and our allies. And whether we're talking about vulnerabilities in our supply chains due to over-reliance on China for critical materials or China's use of financial assistance to advance their political goals, we need deeper coordination with our allies to tackle these challenges. For example, I've been eager to find ways for the United States to work more closely with our allies to bolster the resiliency of our medical supply chains, including life-saving medical treatments, including devices, and including other equipment. I'll be introducing legislation in the coming weeks to support the resiliency of our medical supply chains by shifting investments out of China and into the Western Hemisphere. And I look forward to discussing that with our ranking member, Senator Cornyn, and with his staff. I oftentimes say, maybe more than I should, I have these sayings I like to use over and over again. And one of them is, you can do it, we can help. That's just one of 100 or more. But I like to say, find out what works and do more of that. When I was governor of Delaware for 8 years, we focused a lot on what can we learn from other states. And rather than Delaware, we were just reinventing the wheel or something. Why don't we learn from other states what they're doing to address a particular problem or not? So I believe that to my core. My wife wants to know what I want to put on my tombstone when I die. And I'm in perfectly good health, so I don't say, honey, we don't have to rush into that. But I say, how about find out what works and do more of that? Some people will see that tombstone in the future and say, he must have been a very interesting person. So we'll see. But I hope that today's hearing leads to a better understanding of what works to strengthen trade and economic coordination across the Western Hemisphere, including using diplomatic and economic tools to advance our shared values and our shared goals. Once more, I want to thank our ranking member and his team, and I want to thank all of you for appearing before us today and all of our staffs. And with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Senator Cornyn for his opening statement. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today. I recently led a bipartisan delegation to Panama, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil to investigate, among other things, the PRC's growing influence in the region. In recent decades, as we know, China has made massive investments across Latin America, including transportation infrastructure, energy projects, and so much more. Of course, these investments are not an act of generosity. Rather, it's a way for China to project power around the world and gain access to valuable natural resources, among other things. We heard the same message from all of the heads of state that we visited with. They don't trust China. They understand that Belt and Road projects crumble shortly after they're built, and that the debt from the PRC comes with strings attached. Despite these risks, some of these leaders feel like they have no alternative. They explain the difficulties saying no to free roads, stable currency, and generous trade agreements. In each country, we heard there was a clear preference for the United States over a relationship with China. Unfortunately, they do not see the United States stepping up and offering a better option. While on the surface, our relationships remain strong in Latin America, paradoxically, our allies and partners are sliding away from the United States and closer to the PRC. We can see this happening in a growing number of Latin American countries when they accept Belt and Road projects. cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan, agree to trade with the PRC in yuan rather than dollars, and even allow the PRC to bring military assets into the region. The bottom line is that the strong and enduring relationship we've had with Latin America over the last 200 years is not a given. We have to work harder to maintain it and to grow it. With growing influence of the PRC in the Western Hemisphere, our friends and allies must have other options to choose from. So we have to be engaged in the region and remind our allies and our partners that the United States always has been and always will be the best option. The good news is that our Latin American allies and partners want increased trade with the United States, and by and large, they're skeptical of the PRC's motives. Leaders from each country we visited told us that they would prefer a good option at the right price from the United States compared to a free option from the PRC. If given that choice, they would choose the United States virtually every time. Fortunately, the solution is not as complex as it may seem. At each stop, we heard the same thing. The way to outcompete China and Latin America is through new free trade agreements. Increased trade, not free infrastructure and cheap debt, is how the United States shows it is the better option. To compete with the PRC and build enduring relationships, the United States has to work with our allies and partners to build the right investment climate for businesses. New free trade agreements in Latin America would provide the confidence needed to promote investment and economic growth in the United States and the region. And like the chairman, I recently led another group to Mexico City where we sat down and visited with President Lopez Obrador, and we attempted to explain what a historic opportunity there was to bring back some of those supply chains from Asia back to North America, and what a great opportunity it would be for Mexico, among other countries, to help encourage that. Time will tell whether that had much of an impact or not, but I am glad, like you said, Mr. Chairman, that USMC is in place. But it seems so obvious that, that Mexico is already an important part of our manufacturing supply chains, and it seems like it shouldn't be that hard to just grow it in a way that's mutually beneficial to them by creating jobs and growing their economy, and beneficial to us because of the security of those supply chains, for example. Of course, opportunities for nearshoring critical supply chains, building our partners and allies' investment climates, stimulating both U.S. and partner industrial bases, and growing the market for small businesses, and accessing the abundant but untapped rare earth deposits in Latin America. There's a lot of opportunity out there. It's no secret that Washington often has its sights set elsewhere in the world. Latin America has not been one of our priorities. Yet the opportunities to strengthen our mutual interests in trade, free markets, and democracy and regional security are potentially limitless. We need to compete, and that means first we need to show up, and we need to prevent China from destabilizing our shared hemisphere, and we also have the opportunity to forge deeper and lasting ties with countries whose economies, resources, industrial capacity, and shared values with the United States have endured for centuries. So I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses and maybe asking a few questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Our first witness, let me just go down the line here. Our first witness is Mr. Jonathan Fantini Porter, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Partnership for Central America. The partnership, as you may know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-governmental organization that works with a multilateral coalition of private organizations to advance economic opportunity across the Northern Triangle countries, including El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Launched as a key component of the Vice President's call to action, the partnership aims to support economic development, address climate change, and promote investment in the region. And previously, I believe Mr. Fantini Porter served as a national security aide at the White House, a congressional aide in both chambers of the U.S. Congress, and as a chief of staff in the United States Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Fantini Porter, you have the floor. And do you go by Fantini Porter?
Porter is just fine, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator, thank you for that introduction. Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the challenges and approaches to achieving greater economic cooperation across the Western Hemisphere. Before offering brief introductory remarks, I'd like to thank you, Chairman Carper, for leading, as you mentioned, a bipartisan and bicameral delegation to Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras, which builds on Vice President Harris's work with the Partnership for Central America to address the root causes of migration and strengthen relationships between our countries. I'd also like to thank the bipartisan leadership of Senator Cassidy and Senator Bennett, sir, for your co-sponsorship of the Milestone Americas Act, which offers an important set of solutions to strengthen cooperation in the hemisphere. I'd also importantly like to thank you, Ranking Member Cornyn, for the co-delegation that you led to the region, as well as your engagement in the region over these many, many years. Thank you, sir. Unified Western Hemisphere, Senators, is a critical pillar of our nation's long-term economic competitiveness and national security. Comprised of over 1 billion people with a shared cultural bond, a GDP of more than 35 trillion, and a range of comparative advantages, we are considerably stronger together than apart. Enhanced cooperation would make us stronger in countering the influence of strategic competitors such as China, as Senator Cornyn alluded to, and stem the root causes of irregular migration, which Chairman Carper alluded to, while strengthening the U.S. economy and furthering our climate goals by nearshoring and integrating supply chains. There are a number of foundational pillars in achieving greater cooperation, including trade policies to incentivize nearshoring while strengthening American jobs, diplomatic engagement, development assistance and financing to improve infrastructure, consistency across labor protections and the rule of law, and investment promotion and supply chain integration. This is where the Partnership for Central America comes in, Senators, as a model for investment promotion to nearshore and integrate supply chains that create economic growth in both the United States and across the region. As an independent, nonpartisan organization, we're working through a public-private partnership with the U.S. government and more than 100 partners to mobilize investments that advance economic growth and sustainable development goals. Senators, in just 18 months, the partnership has delivered unprecedented impact in the region, if I may say, including mobilizing more than $4.2 billion in corporate and civil society investments, as Chairman Carper noted, of which more than $500 million of those investments have been deployed on the ground. Alongside diplomatic, trade, and development pillars, the partnership can serve as a model for the necessary private sector mobilization that is required today to achieve greater economic integration and sustainable development goals across the Americas. These programs have delivered results in communities. For example, children from a rural indigenous community in Comayagua, Honduras, are now able to access the internet. This creates, for these families, access to the global economy and an immeasurable potential for their lives. Similarly, one of PCA's partners launched its first line of coffee from 2 Northern Central American countries represented today in the audience as part of its $150 million commitment to this effort. This is a tangible example of how greater coordination and cooperation can lead to new investments from global companies that deliver high-quality jobs and achieve our strategic objectives across the Americas, including stemming the economic roots of migration and countering the incursion of strategic competitors in the Americas. The Western Hemisphere faces a range, Senators, of foundational challenges, including forced migration, corruption, and strategic adversaries. A singular plan for the Americas that strengthens economic cooperation could bring our region together around a common vision and make the most of this brief post-COVID moment to become a nearshoring hub while strengthening American jobs. During the course of our discussion today, I look forward to sharing the partnership's public-private model of investment promotion as a case study in successfully nearshoring global firms to achieve economic growth and sustainable development. With that, I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
You're welcome, but it is we who thank you. And our next witness is Eric Farnsworth, and he's the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. Welcome. Nice to see you. Mr. Farnsworth leads the Washington office of the Council of the Americas, an international business organization, no stranger to us, whose members share a common commitment to economic and social development, open markets, the rule of law, and democracy throughout the Western Hemisphere. Prior to his time at the Council, Mr. Farnsworth served in government with the U.S. Department of State, with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the White House under the former President Clinton. Mr. Farnsworth, welcome, and or as we say in South America, Latin America, bienvenido. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gracias, muy amable. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members, I really want to take a moment to thank you not just for your interest in this topic, but for your leadership in terms of the issues that you are focusing on during a particularly complicated time across the Americas, both politically and economically. And I also want to thank the ambassadors and the diplomatic corps who've shown out in real force this afternoon to show their interest and support on these topics and the obvious interest in working together as real partners with the United States. Latin America and the Caribbean were hit hard by the COVID pandemic. The human costs were the highest worldwide. Economically, budgets strained under new spending requirements, debt increased, and rapidly rising U.S. and global interest rates have made debt more difficult to service. The World Bank suggests that headwinds are increasing and that the outlook for 2023 is substantially bleaker, that's their quote, than 2022, which itself achieved no great results. Forecasts for the out years suggest growth will remain insufficient to create the jobs the region requires to reduce poverty significantly, address rising social demands, and mitigate social tensions. Leaders are ultimately responsible for job creation and development in their own economies, but we can help. And I think maybe, Mr. Chairman, this is where the Home Depot doctrine would apply to the Western Hemisphere. If we want to support U.S. interests, however, including our own economic growth, supply chain security and resiliency, regional development that discourages migration and illegal activities, democratic governance, and, crucially, maintaining a privileged position in the Americas, I believe we have to help, because alternatives now exist, namely China, that didn't before. There is so much Washington can do now to support our friends across the region, many of whom have called for enhanced economic and trade relations even as they are being actively and aggressively courted by Beijing. There is no reason, for example, that Washington cannot propose regional liberalization of individual economic sectors such as environmental technology, goods, and services, including clean energy, where the region is a global bright spot and a critical partner in combating climate change. Or the digital economy, or healthcare, or other sectors, consistent with and building on existing efforts and political priorities. And I believe we should also be more proactive and responsive to the specific trade-related requests of our democratic friends, including Brazil, Ecuador, Uruguay, and others. But if we really want to recapture the strategic initiative in the Americas, and I believe we do, we should consider expanding the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, USMCA, which has already been talked about in this session, into the rest of the hemisphere. USMCA was negotiated and overwhelmingly passed on a bipartisan basis. It included new provisions around digital, clean energy, and other sectors that are lacking in previous generation freer trade agreements. To remain competitive, these agreements will have to be updated and upgraded, drawing supply chains away from China and strengthening resiliency, while rebuilding regional economies and creating jobs in the formal sector. This is not a call for bloc-to-bloc negotiations, which are cumbersome and inconvenient. Rather, the idea would be to offer USMCA accession to democratic partners individually as they show the desire and capacity to meet the standards and obligations the agreement requires. Costa Rica, for example, has already expressed interest and would make an appropriate new party to the agreement. Such an approach would also ensure that troublesome partners such as Nicaragua do not gain USMCA access without a return to the democratic path. At some point, hemispheric nations without pre-existing freer trade agreements should also have an opportunity to accede to the USMCA, and in this category I would place Ecuador, which has also expressed interest. This could incentivize commitments and reforms that otherwise might not occur absent market access provisions and broader sectoral coverage that provide certainty and rule of law to investors. Early movers would gain the most from relocating supply chains, thus creating competition for access to the agreement and a built-in impetus to take actions that might otherwise be too difficult politically for them to take. The Americas Act, co-sponsored on a bipartisan basis by Senators Cassidy and Bennett, which has already been mentioned, is a major step in this direction. It would help recapture the regional narrative from those who may question Washington's reliability. It would also undercut the notion, now aggressively being promoted by Beijing and their amplifiers, that Latin America and the Caribbean have just as much or more to gain from China as the United States. We applaud the authors of this initiative, and there are others as well. The Western Hemisphere is in play. Hearts and minds are up for grabs as the region suffers from pandemic after effects, willing to consider both non-traditional domestic and international options. U.S.-led economic engagement can be an effective corrective, building partnerships, linking allies, drawing job-creating direct investment in strategic sectors, and strengthening democratic governance. But we must first choose to engage. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the invitation to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks for those words. Next witness, I'd like to introduce Margaret Myers. What is your full name?
Margaret Myers-Mullenix.
Like 3M, right?
3Ms.
3M, there you go. Next witness is Margaret Myers, Director of the Asia and Latin American Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Ms. Myers has published extensive research on China's relations with the Latin America and Caribbean region. Previously, Ms. Myers worked as a Latin American analyst and China analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense, during which time she was deployed with the U.S. Navy in support of partnership of the Americas. Retired Navy captain, salute you. Thank you for that service. Ms. Myers, you have the floor, and welcome today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, and the members of the subcommittee for, first of all, working diligently toward a bipartisan solution on this really critical issue, but also, of course, for the opportunity to share my views on advancing economic cooperation for a stronger and more resilient Western Hemisphere. As a specialist on China's engagement with the region, I offer some thoughts today, not just on prospects for engaging more extensively with the hemisphere, but also on the ways in which U.S. prospects are shaped by China's many efforts across the Americas. I'd first of all note that this is a critical moment for expanded engagement. Nearly every country in our region is facing similar obstacles in pursuit of economic recovery and future growth, educational setbacks, extreme weather events, fiscal limitations, historic migration flows, and wide-ranging other shared challenges. There is considerable need and indeed justification for enhanced hemispheric cooperation to advance many of our common objectives. For the United States, there is also tremendous opportunity to promote not only our own industrial and diplomatic interests, but also economic progress across the hemisphere, especially by deepening our engagement with emerging sectors across the region, including those related to energy and digital transformation, in addition to medical and pharma industries, as was mentioned previously. Targeted investment in these industries and expanded, focused value chain development would do much to both advance U.S. competitiveness and hemispheric growth. But if we are to engage in these and other areas, now is most certainly the time to do so. Time is truly of the essence as China grows its technological outreach and economic presence in these and other industries. In a matter of years, through a series of targeted investments and subsidized offerings, China has established prominent, even dominant, economic positions, including in energy generation and transmission, telecommunications, renewable energy, electromobility, and now critical minerals. The U.S. policy toward Latin America should not be a China policy. It should not be principally motivated by U.S. interest in competing with China in the region. Pursuing stronger economic ties within the hemisphere is a critical objective in its own right, with direct implications for the U.S. economy and regional security and stability. But our ability to be competitive in international markets and strategic industries requires understanding of China's efforts and positioning in the Western Hemisphere, including in the Caribbean, frankly, which has been an outsized recipient of Chinese finance and other attention in recent years. And with that in mind, I would offer that if we are serious about engaging economically with our region and remaining competitive with China in the process, trade is fundamental, as Senator Carper mentioned. So much of China's influence in the region is derived from its ever-expanding commercial partnerships, even when they are advancing economic reprimarization in much of Latin America. Ecuador signed a trade agreement with China just days ago. A Uruguayan trade deal and possible Central American agreements are also on the horizon. Even a focus on deepening existing U.S. agreements, if not signing new ones, would be welcome at this juncture. In pursuit of stronger ties, new private sector investment in the hemisphere, including through nearshoring, is of course helpful, even more so when the investment has strategic implications such as concerns semiconductor supply. But it's also critical to simply maintain our presence in sectors where U.S. companies have been active for decades. Crafting incentives for U.S. and partner nation companies not just to engage anew, but also to stay the course in the region will be of great consequence. We also must look to add value in the hemisphere, including by helping to develop regional supply chains, as noted. This is what the region needs and wants, and is among the very best ways for us to ensure strong and binding economic ties. U.S. investment and trade in the hemisphere has historically been far more diversified than China's. We have a strong record of adding value that can and should be expanded upon. Doing more will require the removal of barriers to financial engagement, many of them administrative in nature, and even more opening up to channels for direct G2G involvement in certain cases where needed. Ensuring a prominent U.S. role within the hemisphere and competitiveness with China also, of course, requires sustained commitment to addressing our own economic challenges and societal needs. Robust commitments to improving U.S. domestic conditions will naturally boost competitiveness and generate prospects for broader and longer-term hemispheric cooperation. U.S. companies must stay competitive, but so must the U.S. model, including in the eyes of our hemispheric partners. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for those words. And our fourth witness is Kathy Feingold. And when I met her, I said, "Are you related to Russ Feingold, who used to be our senator? I think was from Minnesota." Is that?
Oh,
I'm sorry?
I'm from Illinois.
I know you are, but there's no relationship, is there?
No relation.
Okay, very good. Well, we're glad to. Every now and then we hear from him, but we're happy today to hear from you. And welcome, and please proceed. Your full statement will be made part of the record. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, and the distinguished members of this committee for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. It's truly a privilege to be here today representing the 60 trade unions and 12.5 million workers who are part of the AFL-CIO. With my limited time, let me touch on a number of recommendations related to trade, investment, immigration, and priority supply chains across the region. On trade, it is essential that we learn from the failure of the Central American Free Trade Agreement to generate decent work and sustainable economic growth in the region. CAFTA contained strong rights for foreign investors, but weak commitments to international labor standards and environmental protections. So what can be done? Here, I think we can learn from our experience with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. USMCA required Mexico to overhaul its weak labor laws and created a new rapid response labor mechanism, ensuring employer compliance at the factory level. While many challenges remain, we're encouraged by the López Obrador administration's evident commitment to labor rights reform and this administration's successful use of the rapid response mechanism to address worker rights abuses and advance independent union organizing in a number of factories in Mexico. And that will help raise wages both in Mexico and here in the United States. Let me share a few recommendations based on USMCA. We need to upgrade CAFTA's labor provisions as well as all FTAs to include a rapid response labor mechanism. Access to the U.S. market should be a privilege, not a right. Remove harmful provisions like the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms from all agreements. Ensure that APEP and any future FTAs, including critical mineral agreements, include strong and enforceable labor provisions as contained in the USMCA. They should also contain strong rules of origin to ensure that workers and businesses from the parties to the agreement are the primary beneficiaries, not third parties like China. On investment, we support Vice President Harris's call to action and recognize the potential of new investments by the U.S. companies to generate good jobs in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. However, we cannot assume that any U.S. corporate investment will create good jobs, and we have cautioned that these investments must be accompanied by social and environmental safeguards. To accomplish that, workers and unions must have mechanisms to give regular input to the process and to hold employers accountable for violations of human and trade union rights. To date, those are entirely missing. There has simply not been enough transparency or engagement from the administration or the various public-private initiatives on how they will ensure that these investments will meet international standards for responsible investment, anti-corruption issues, worker rights, and environmental protection. We also believe that unions in the U.S., especially those that have strong leadership from Central America, can play a critical role in this initiative by providing best practices on apprenticeship programs and workforce training models. With recent leadership changes in key allies like Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, there is real opportunity for this administration to promote a model of inclusive economic growth that delivers for workers here and across the Americas. If APEC is modeled on the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Model, APEC, it will be important to ground the scope of work in a worker-centered approach to trade and investment. The scope of work of APEC must move beyond the APEC's narrow focus on trade and investment liberalization to building a new regional model based on the needs of workers, their families, and the environment. As APEC moves forward, close consultation with labor, environmental groups, civil society, and Congress will be vital to shaping the priorities for this initiative and building support. APEC can be an important forum for developing a new model for building partnerships around critical minerals. The AFL-CIO and our affiliates support the need to secure critical minerals for clean energy transition, and we believe we need to invest here in the United States to safely extract and process these minerals, as well as to ensure that any mining in partner countries includes close consultation with unions and impacted communities. On immigration, for too long we have seen failed U.S. foreign and trade policies that have prioritized the needs of corporations and not those of workers. And because trade policy, development assistance, and broader foreign economic interventions have not done enough to support the emergence of resilient domestic markets, economies in the region have grown reliant on migration and remittances. We urge policymakers to think big about the shifts that are needed to address pernicious injustices in the region and scale up investment in assistance that supports decent work so that migration becomes a choice rather than a means of survival. As work to address root causes continues, regional migration strategies should prioritize regularization schemes such as temporary protected status and rights-based channels which allow migrants the freedom to move, settle, work, and fully participate in society. We recommend this over expanding flawed and abusive temporary labor migration programs. In short, we have a lot to do to ensure that trade is an engine of sustainable growth for all workers in the Americas, but the worker-centered trade agenda gives us a good map moving forward. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today.
You bet, and thank you for addressing us today. Our final witness today would be Neil Harrington, and not last but not least, we welcome you. As I understand, Senior Vice President for the Americas Department at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and in this role, Mr. Harrington manages the Americas Department programs, councils, and policy initiatives across the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Harrington also serves as president of the U.S.-Cuba Business Council, the U.S.-Colombia Business Council, and the U.S.-Argentina Business Council. Before joining the Chamber in 2014, Mr. Harrington held posts in both the private and the public sector, including a stint as director of the State of California's Office of Trade and Investment in Mexico City, and service with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he was senior advisor to the Deputy U.S. TR for Asia and Africa. Who was our ambassador there, U.S. Trade Rep then?
Susan Schwab, sir.
There you go. Well, anyway, Mr. Harrington, the floor is yours. Make the most of it. Thanks so much and welcome.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I want to echo the sentiments expressed by my colleagues and appreciation not only for this opportunity, but from the dedication and commitment that this committee continues to demonstrate towards the region and its issues, challenges, and opportunities. I'm also honored to be joined by such an esteemed panel of my colleagues here. In the Americas, the Chamber runs a 55-year-old network of American chambers of commerce across Latin America and the Caribbean. 5 bilateral business councils, and a variety of other bilateral and multilateral initiatives. We believe that the most effective way to drive inclusive growth and widespread opportunity across the region is through economic integration, enhanced market access, and business-led solutions. As part of the 9th Summit of the Americas last June, the Chamber was proud to partner with the State Department to host the 4th CEO Summit of the Americas, a private sector-focused event which gathered regional heads of state, policymakers, think tanks, and leaders of businesses large and small from across the hemisphere. We leveraged the opportunity to align with the summit's leaders meeting in order to spark a public-private dialogue across 6 priorities critical to fostering growth in the region: adherence to rule of law, digital transformation, resilient health systems, energy and sustainability, support for small and mid-sized companies, and trade, one critical priority that wasn't included on the leaders' agenda. A key takeaway from the CEO Summit was that the regional private sector is already hard at work addressing these priorities and is committed to do much more. What we're asking of regional governments is that they help foster conditions conducive to business in areas like trade policy, regulation, taxation, and most importantly, adherence to rule of law. I'll briefly highlight 2 of these. When it comes to trade policy, the fact that 12 of the U.S.'s 20 free trade agreement partners are in Western Hemisphere countries provides an important foundation upon which to build. Partly due to the excellent market access these FTAs provide, U.S. exporters, our regional neighbors purchased more than $900 billion in U.S. merchandise exports in 2022, or nearly 44% of all U.S. merchandise exports. In addition to improving market access for U.S. companies, high-standard trade agreements contribute to strengthening the rule of law in the region by requiring our partners to provide a transparent and predictable legal framework, to address regulatory transparency, and to ensure protection of intellectual property rights. Additional regional market access opportunities should be pursued, which is why we support members of the Senate who have called for FTA negotiations with Ecuador and Uruguay. Sir. And of course, no priority is more important than compliance with and enforcement of our existing FTAs. When it comes to USMCA, the Chamber continues to raise a number of troubling issues surrounding implementation, compliance, and enforcement of the agreement, especially with regard to Mexico. We've appreciated the strong voices on this subcommittee also urging compliance from our partners and enforcement from USTR. In terms of quick trade wins, Congress can help by continuing to ensure timely approval and renewal of trade preference programs such as GSP and Haiti Hope Help Acts. For years, Chamber member companies have identified weak rule of law as the #1 challenge facing U.S. companies doing business in the region. In response, the Chamber has been at the forefront of promoting adherence to rule of law as the key to government's ability to increase investment and trade and help drive sustainable economic growth. To bring greater attention to the importance of rule of law, 10 years ago, the Chamber's Americas program developed the Global Business Rule of Law Dashboard. What was once a regional initiative today covers more than 100 markets around the world and tracks 5 core critical factors to business success: transparency, predictability, stability, accountability, and due process. We have found that where these factors are present, investment thrives, economies grow, jobs are created, and prosperity follows. Conversely, in markets where these factors are weak or absent, corruption thrives, informality reigns, investment dollars flee, and tax revenues plummet. The 4th and most recent version of our dashboard revealed that Latin America and the Caribbean are lagging significantly behind, earning the lowest average score of any region of the world. The Chamber and our partners at the region's AmChams have no greater objective than to raise awareness of the importance of the rule of law to attract investment and generate broad-based economic growth. Without it, potentially transcendent economic opportunities for the hemisphere, such as nearshoring, will remain elusive. In spite of the challenges, the opportunities to foster inclusive growth through enhanced economic cooperation and integration across the region are immense. The Chamber stands ready to work with members of the committee to help advance policies that will build closer ties with our partners and build a stronger, more resilient Western Hemisphere. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our views in this important hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Harrington, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you for your presence, and thanks very much for your testimony. I think I'd like to ask a question. This will probably be for Mr. Fantini, rather for Mr. Porter. And for Mr. Harrington, how do rule of law issues hinder investment and economic opportunity? How can the U.S. support our allies to strengthen rule of law and create an environment for job creation? So just a little bit of background. I've been treasurer and congressman for Delaware, been a naval flight officer, and moved to Delaware, got to be elected governor. And before I was sworn in, actually just after I was sworn in as governor, I hosted a former governor to come and have lunch with me at the governor's house. And his name's Bert Carvel. He's like a great giant of a man, and older fellow, but he's like very wise, very smart, a very successful businessman and Democrat. And we sat down and we had lunch, and he said, went right to the point. He said, Governor, for you, here's my strongest piece of advice. I hope you'll take this to heart. I said, what would that be, Governor Carvel? And he said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And I said, would you say that again? And he said, yes, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. He said, do you know what I mean? And I said, I think I do. And I said, you're talking about what is fun, figure out what's important and keep that in mind. He said, yes. And he said at the time, he said, oh gosh, close to 50% of the state of Delaware's revenues came from corporations from America and around the world that are incorporated in Delaware, pay franchise tax, provide about half of our revenues. One of the reasons why they do that is because we have a great judiciary and with really smart judges and the rule of law, certainty and predictability, which companies are always interested in. And he said, just keep that in mind. Don't be the governor who killed the goose that laid the golden egg. When I led, and I suspect Senator Cornyn heard a fair amount of this when he led a CODEL down to Central America recently. But we heard in one country after that, rule of law, how important rule of law was. We heard that not just from an acknowledgement by the leaders of Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, but we heard a lot from the business community. We heard from non-business communities as well. Rule of law is critical. If you don't have that, it's like what they used to say about integrity. If you have it, nothing else matters. Integrity, if you don't have it, nothing else matters. And the same is true as rule of law. But how do rule of law issues hinder investment and economic opportunity? And how can the U.S. support our allies and to strengthen the rule of law and create an environment for job creation? And I'm going to ask Mr. Porter if you'd lead off, and then Mr. Harrington, please.
Certainly, Senator. Thank you for the question. You used the word "the main thing." I'd echo your sentiment. Corruption, weaknesses in rule of law is among the main thing hindering investment to Northern Central America. I'd note that the IMF has found that $13 billion is lost in productivity annually in Northern Central America, and that Northern Central America, according to Transparency International, ranks among 103, have a worse ranking than 103 of the 180 countries ranked by Transparency International. In actions to counter this, to your point of how we've sort of taken an approach to respond to this. So the first piece I just note is that with Vice President Harris and our call to action partners, we've launched the Good Governance, Good Jobs Declaration, which is our partnership's commitment and actions to combat corruption and to protect labor rights in the region. I'd note that as one first example. That said, Senator, when we think about systemic challenges, corruption in this context is one of those, a systemic challenge. And what we would hope to do, noting that there have been limited significant improvements in this area, is to work with this body and our partners at this table to identify opportunities to work together comprehensively to attack and approach a challenge that at the end of the day is a systemic challenge. Senator, I'd note that as an approach, working together to take this challenge on collaboratively. I'll end there and pass to my colleague.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to commend the work of PCA and Jonathan. We've been partnered since the beginning, right? Many of our companies have stepped up with major commitments supporting this effort. This is an effort we've undertaken since the Alliance for Prosperity. Senator Carper, I know you've been very involved since then, even if not before. And I think you said it. It's funny because I've had the same thought before. You can talk about supply chain resiliency. You can talk about building things like digital connectivity. You can talk about ensuring resilient healthcare systems, all of things we're focused on. But if you don't have rule of law, you have nothing. I think that's really well said. And I think that in this case for business, what is the impact? As I think a lot of you who've been in business previously know very well, business is certainty. Certainty for business is everything. And what lack of adherence to the rule of law does is it undermines business certainty. And so businesses are going to go and look for other options and other locations in which to invest, which in the case of Northern Central America, we can't afford collectively. What can we do about it? I think one of the things that we set out early on in working with PCA and other stakeholders in this effort is suggesting ways in which we can strengthen institutional capacity building, working with public sector partners and ensuring that they're committed to upholding the rule of law, and certainly governance in the region, frankly speaking, remains, I think, one of the biggest challenges we see coming from 2014 when President Obama launched the alliance to now. I think that still remains the biggest impediment. Something else we can do, promote the adoption of business ethics and good governance programs. The Commerce Department has great programs in this area, and I think those are things, Jonathan can correct me, but I think those are things that PCA and the Vice President's office have leveraged. This one's key too, deploying digital tools. One of our members has a great anecdote that says, a bit can't take a bribe. So when you're talking about digital tools enhancing transparency, ensuring that in customs, in permitting, in licensing, in taxation, you avoid having the urge of a customs official, for example, to take a bribe. It's actually not possible if you can digitize everything. Lastly, and I'll leave it here, really working with partners to combat IP piracy and counterfeiting as well. It's critical in the region.
Good. My thanks to both of you for your response to that question. I'm going to yield now to Senator Cornyn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Porter, I think a couple times in your testimony you talked about root causes of migration. Coming from Texas, we have a fair amount of experience with the migration challenges, and the Border Patrol likes to talk about push factors and pull factors. And I agree with you that some of the push factors, violence, poverty, we all understand that. But there's also the pull factors. I won't make this a hearing on immigration policy, but the perception that you're free to come to the United States and you'll be escorted to the interior of the United States and be able to stay here for years is, I think, a pull factor which is causing us a lot of problems. The other thing I would just say about looking at root causes is the United States is not very good at nation building. And so I think what we need to do is try to work with our partners and friends in South America to help them as they grow their economy. But it's pretty complicated. Mr. Harrington mentioned the rule of law. You have to have an independent judiciary in order to make sure the rule of law actually means something. So lots of challenges. But I would just invite you all, in the short time we have here, it's not a whole lot of time to talk about too many details, but I think one of the things we found when we went to Senator Shaheen, Senator Lee, Marshall, Fisher, Budd, and Crapo, and I went to, as I said, to Panama and Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil. Two of the things that I think we overlook are our education system. I remember when CAFTA was being considered, going to Central America with Senator Shelby from Alabama, and many of the leaders we met there had received advanced education in the United States. It's a very powerful way for us to understand one another, and the other is just our military-to-military ties that can sort of stabilize sometimes the tempest of political leadership, whether it's in the United States or other countries. Those military education and those has a way of providing stability. But I want to ask all of you, as well as the ambassadors in the audience, please share with us your ideas about things we can do to strengthen our ties with the region. It's really, really important. Ms. Myers, let me ask you about trade. I don't believe the Biden administration is interested in negotiating any true new trade agreements. And assuming that's the case, how do we significantly increase our economic presence in the region while bolstering our own economic and national security interests? If we can't do any trade agreements, what do we do?
Shall I respond? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we are paralyzed in this respect from a political perspective at the moment. We see not only interest in, or a lack of interest in striking new bilateral free trade agreements, but also a disinterest in rejoining the CPTPP. There's also been, in general, the extent to which there is a trade policy, right, and an interest in engaging more extensively in trade agreements. It's not focused on the Latin American region. It's focused on Europe and elsewhere. There are things I think we can do within the context of existing trade agreements to deepen them, to expand them, to include new chapters, to modernize them. Whether there's appetite for that or not remains to be seen, but certainly there is some possibility there. There are also efforts for us to engage, I think, in digital infrastructure development, if not trade, then to expand infrastructure across the region that promotes at least, cross-regional trade in various forms, if not through formal agreements. But with the dynamics as they are, I think we all recognize that trade is fundamental, especially if we are to compete effectively with China, which derives most of its influence from its commercial relationships. That trade is critical, but indeed, this is something that we really need to grapple with and think about very critically. Supply chain development is an important part of this, but must be accompanied, obviously, by new efforts to develop trade relations and to facilitate open trade in much of the region. I'd say also, just as a final point, a lot of the talk today has been about Central America and Mexico. When we're talking China, and China's rise, China's engagement over the past 2 decades now, and the extent to which China has engaged, really across the entire region, there are major disparities in the extent of U.S. activity and influence in different sub-regions within Latin America and the Caribbean. And indeed, we are losing the battle most expansively in the context of South America. So as much as it is critical to develop these linkages within the Central American and Mexican context, and to invest more extensively there through what the many mechanisms and the extensive and excellent work that my colleagues here are doing, it is also critical for us to think about ways, and indeed some of these supply chain prospects, right, including if we're talking digital and energy transition, right, apply directly in the context of South America. So I don't have the answers necessarily, or at least not the technical answers, but I do believe that with some creative thinking, there will be some opportunities to engage more extensively, at least in some forms.
I have many more questions, but no time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Those are good questions. One of the things that Senator Corn and I were talking about just before we kicked off this hearing, in terms of what's important, the main thing is the main thing, rule of law is the main thing. Another thing that's hugely important for the U.S. is to have Senate-confirmed ambassadors in virtually every country. South of Texas, and the idea that we have, and we were just talking about a couple of just excellent people have been nominated. They've been nominated like months ago, and we're still waiting for their nominations to move. It's just an awful situation. All right, Senator Cassidy. People say to me every day, why can't Democrats and Republicans work together in the Congress and get things done? I would just say that for our guests and witnesses, the three of us, Cassidy, Corn, and Carper, the 3 Cs. We work on a lot of stuff together, and we get a lot done, and it's a pleasure working with each of them. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Thank you all. I just want to note there are 10 embassies reflected here, 8 on an ambassador level. That is the importance. And Mr. Chair, Mr. Ranking Member, I wouldn't mind if a later hearing we had those guys and gals up here speaking, because I think we will learn so much from them. So thank you very much for being represented here.
I'm Tom Carper, and I approve that message.
Mr. Harrington, I always like to steal good rhetoric. A bit doesn't take a bribe. I like that. One of the things in the Americas Act, and a couple of you mentioned the Americas Act, thank you very much, is an e-governance system where we imagine that somebody, a business that would, instead of having to go to an office and pay somebody a consideration in order to have their permit given, they would go online, they would then go online and file their, whatever they filed. It would be auditable, so a company doing business in that country could go online themselves and see if their vendor had paid their taxes. You see where I'm going with that? Ideally, moving companies from the informal to the formal, which would expand the tax base, et cetera. Now, just your thoughts on that, because I see countries around the world doing something like that, and in some regards, South America is ahead of the U.S. as regards their embrace of such things. Thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think it's a critical question, because I think in this sense, we see these digital tools, exactly like you're talking about, e-governance. Not just, I touched on the transparency piece, right? And they're critical for transparency, as you say. They're critical for taking the temptation away from bureaucrats and those who are in positions to reap gain from things like customs revenue and tax revenue. The other two things they bring to the table are inclusive growth. When you're talking about this, what you're doing is you're leveling the playing field for small and medium-sized businesses. So you make it so, and one of the things that USMCA does very well is it has, as a lot of you know, it has a dedicated small business chapter.
Can I go fast, because I got a bunch of questions?
Yeah, go ahead. And so, sorry, I'm forgetting my third thing. I do this all the time, and now I'm blanking on my third.
Okay.
But
it also helps people remember. Mr. Farnsworth, you mentioned, and of course it's in the Americas Act too, allowing countries to ascend to the USMCA. I draw the contrast. Our free trade agreements are kind of hub and spoke. The U.S. goes to a country and the country comes back, but it doesn't go between countries. USMCA goes between Canada and Mexico and the United States. And so the advantage of bolting in, if you will, to USMCA is that it allows a domestic content to include from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras could all count towards the domestic content. What thoughts do you have as to how a country could bolt in, if you will?
Well, I think it's a key question. I really appreciate, again, your leadership on this particular topic. The question is fundamental. In the current text, there is no explicit accession clause, so that would have to be developed in conjunction with our fellow parties, Canada and Mexico, as you've mentioned. But, you know, what this does is it allows for the United States to expand the new generation, and the only example of the new generation of bipartisan trade, which includes labor, which includes the environment, which includes digital clean energy, in a way that previous agreements did not. And so for those who are arguing that those should be included in new trade agreements, the answer is yes, they should on a bipartisan basis. And the way to do that is to take the template we already have and to allow countries that have the capacity and the demonstrated will to meet those high standards to accede into that platform. And I think that is a real opportunity for us. I mean, we talk a lot about enforcement, we talk a lot about impunity, we talk a lot about rule of law. All that is really well and good, but at the local level, that is a politically costly decision for a lot of leaders to take. In order for them to take some of those decisions, there have to be positive incentives. There has to be reasons why they would make those politically difficult steps. And to have access to the largest market in the world, that's a pretty important incentive. Having said that, it also allows us to leverage our own values in the context of labor, in the context of the environment, digital, anti-corruption, all these things that you've taken such a leadership role on, and to be able to say, yes, we support your development through trade, but we also want to do this in a way that's broadly inclusive and broadly supportive of the values that we jointly share. And that's something that China can't bring to the table, but China can bring to the table the money and the incentives, and if we don't provide something that somehow gives those incentives for countries to take these difficult steps, we're just going to be having the same hearing in another 3 years and trying to figure out what's going on and why people
I agree with that.
aren't
Two
taking
things,
up.
Mr. Chair, although I'm out of time. Both of y'all went over, so I'll take a little bit more. When Ms. Feingold talked about making sure that labor standards are of an adequate standard, we don't want our peoples competing against slave labor. And Latin America does not want to use slave labor. They want to have our labor standards. And so I do think, and I'll point out a success story, if you look at pollution from steel manufacturing, and the U.S. has a unit of 1, and the Europeans have about a unit of 1, and the Canadians 1, Mexico's 1.2. They're almost where we are. And so they've aligned with us in terms of how do we control that sort of thing. China's a 2.4. So we have that kind of commonality of concern. Lastly, well, never mind, I was about to say something I can't. I yield back. Thank you.
That might have been the best part of all. So. All right. Thanks so much for being here and for your leadership. Todd, welcome. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Myers, it's clear that China views Latin America as a critical part of their food and energy supply chain with growing potential. Our American farmers and producers rely on a strong export market, and it appears that China's doing everything that it can to not be our customer. In fact, China's canceling purchases of U.S. grain that they made earlier this year, and corn exports are down 35% from last year. China's turning to other countries in Latin America, particularly Brazil, to meet their needs. This effort's further increasing China's influence in the region as they're becoming an increasingly important customer. And we all know what kind of retaliation China is capable of if these trading partners don't subscribe to the CCP playbook. It's called economic coercion. This will be the top item on the agenda of the G7 this month in Hiroshima. To what extent is China pivoting to Latin America instead of the United States as a source for food and energy resources, in your estimation? And what are the implications of this shift?
It's a terrific and timely question. Thank you. Certainly, I think there's been a pivot not only to Latin America, but to the Global South in general, as China encounters more and more difficulties and, a much more tense dynamic, especially, in the China-U.S. context, but also in other parts of the global north. We see this happening, not just in the agricultural realm, and certainly there's much more reliance, especially on Brazil, but also other parts of the Southern Cone, major soy producers in particular, other producers of commodities too, and this is, the impetus behind a lot of the trade agreements that are potentially being struck in this region, right? But it doesn't stop there, right? The Latin American region, but also the rest of the Global South, is the primary destination for Chinese technological goods and services, for that matter, in part because, again, there are obstacles to doing these things in other parts of the world. And so there has been a doubling down on engagement in various forms, also on the narrative, right, that China is sharing. The Belt and Road is a global initiative, but the Global Development Initiative will be largely focused on the Global South. And so we see a real reorientation across the board, including in the form of diplomatic and human resources, wherein you have such an expansive presence on the ground in Global South nations to develop these various trade dynamics and export relationships. They're unparalleled. And they are at the subnational level, both state and provincial level, and municipalities, but in municipalities of, 50,000 people, looking to, over the course of potentially 10 years, strike a deal that is supportive of food or energy security, or else some other project, that China has its eyes on, including, for example, in the lithium sector. So I completely agree with your assessment, and I think it's far more expansive than we even realize.
That was a fantastic and sweeping summary of the implications. So I really appreciate that. So that's why I didn't interject. Ms. Myers, Latin America, as you alluded to, holds a dominant position in the global production of critical minerals. the region boasts about 40% of the world's copper production. I think that's right, and supplies about a third, maybe a little more than a third of global lithium, serving that market, thanks to significant contributions from Chile and Argentina. The U.S. increasingly is depending on access to these critical minerals, some of it driven by consumer demand, much of it driven by regulation and legislation. China continues to increase investments in mineral-rich territories across the world, including several Latin American countries. You just mentioned this. So given China's strong foothold in the mining sector throughout Latin America, how might the U.S. effectively compete to safeguard its own access to these indispensable resources?
This will be a matter of incentivizing investment on the part of not just U.S. companies, but partner nation companies as well. And was part of what I had hoped to communicate in my 5 minutes of commentary, and hopefully I do so in my written testimony more convincingly, that we need to focus our efforts to compete effectively with China, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but globally, are very wide-ranging. Some of them are more effective than others. I think they're growing more sophisticated and more creative. We're coming up with new solutions to overcoming some of the barriers that we've encountered to being agile and investing within a certain time frame that will make us competitive and allow us to access critical assets. But right now, there is very limited incentive on the part of some companies to engage, depending upon the country, depending upon the regulations in place and the investment environment.
Well, it seems to me, and I won't be long, but just an observation, and maybe you can kind of nod or offer a 10-second response, but there's a certain methodology that we need to approach as we think about critical minerals. We need to do our best to assess the current and future need for particular discrete critical minerals. We need to figure out where all those are found or those are supposed to be at particular estimated rates of extraction. There's a lot of different assumptions associated with these different scenarios. Then we need to divide and conquer with trusted allies and determine who's going to get the lithium, who's going to get the copper. And of course, along the way, we need to figure out where we can have a requisite processing capacity for each of these different things. All of this should be laid out, made available to members of Congress, either in a classified setting or unclassified. And I haven't seen it. We pass the People's Congress. Some of us, are more supportive than others. I wasn't super enamored because I think a lot of this work should have been done on the front end of an Inflation Reduction Act. But this is now the law of the land. We're wedding ourselves to this electrification future. And I don't know where the work is. I don't know where the homework is. Now we're scurrying around. We've actually, in the interest of environmental improvement, which is a very important public policy imperative, we have made our supply chains more brittle at a time where on the semiconductor side and other areas, we're talking about more resiliency. So I'm publicly lament this, but I have quietly and privately tried to shop around for answers. We're just not getting them.
Senator,
I'm sorry. If I could just say, I couldn't agree more with the need for better understanding of the overall landscape and also a strategic plan in this respect. At the same time, we need to understand exactly what China is offering the region, and it's low price, good bids, right, but also promises to help to develop production capacity by building battery factories and wide-ranging other things. Some of these are empty promises, some of them are coming to pass, but if we are to be competitive in this sense, we have to compete, including on their terms.
Thank you all.
Senator, may I add
just very briefly.
30 seconds, because your question's incredibly timely. The Senate is likely to have in front of it soon a vote on the bilateral tax treaty with Chile. It's been in the works a decade, more than a decade now, since 2010. Exactly to your point, not only does it help U.S. companies be more competitive by ending double taxation, but some of the biggest investors in Chile, as you know, invested in very critical industries like the lithium sector, where we're going to have to produce 500%, according to the industry, we're going to have to produce 500% more lithium in the next 10 years to meet demand. This secures exactly what you're talking about. This treaty will secure that bond with Chile and protect U.S. investment at the same time so we can access these critical minerals.
Good. On that note, we're going to pivot. We've been joined by the full chairman of the Finance Committee, Ron Wyden. Senator Wyden, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Senator Carper and Senator Cornyn. Good work on this. And I thought Senator Young's questions were very pertinent and very relevant. And what was important about it is he went sort of sector by sector. And that's very useful. I'm going to take a little bit different tack. When the CHIPS bill came up, this historic legislation that all four of us were very heavily involved in, it was basically on hold for at least 10 hours, maybe a little bit longer. And Senator Crapo, the ranking minority member on this committee, somebody we all work very closely with, essentially walked over to visit with me, and I was in the center of the chamber, and he said, we really ought to take our legislation and see if that can break this open. And as Senator Young knows, Senator Crapo stood up a little bit later and said, I'm here to offer the Crapo-Wyden trade proposal that has been developed in the Senate Finance Committee. And everybody smiled because they weren't exactly sure what was in the Crapo-Wyden China proposal, but they sort of liked the fact it was bipartisan, and we went through a few things, and Senator Crapo said Crapo-Wyden 4 or 5 times, and I said Crapo-Wyden 4 or 5 times, and it got 91 votes. And now Senator Schumer, to his credit, and my colleagues have reacted very positively, are talking about another bill that focuses on increasing our competitiveness with China. And we all decided, I think most everybody up here already knows it, that we're going to start with the legislation that got 91 votes. Because around here, you can hardly get 91 votes for ordering a soda, let alone passing a major piece of legislation. So, Ms. Myers, pretend you were kind of advising all of us to build on the legislation. It had MTBs and GSPs, and my colleagues all remember it. We all agreed on both sides of the aisle on the efforts to push back against China's censorship, which in my view is particularly damaging to our innovators in the technology sector, something I've spent a lot of time on. But this is a new day. That was last Congress. Now we've got to update it. You're us. And Senator Young, let's just stipulate, Senator Young's questions are very, very appropriate and very pertinent. Now we've got to build a trade package into a competitiveness agenda that I hope will be bipartisan. Senator Crapo and I talked at length about how we'd go about doing it, and that's why we said we'll start with the bill. You're us, and what would you put into a trade package now? In other words, you can take from the specifics you gave Senator Young and other ideas you might have. What would you put in it?
So I attempted to talk a little bit about this during a bit earlier, and also in my testimony. But my sense is that, I mean, I'm aiming high here, right? And perhaps idealistically that there can be some discussion motivated, in fact, by this very extensive and shared interest in competing effectively with China globally, but also in this region, but also the critical importance of engaging with our partners on trade terms, which is what they are asking for every time that they visit and every time that we have high-level discussions. I mean, given the political realities, I would again, advocate for a deepening of the existing agreements, right, to whatever extent possible. I would advocate for, an extensive, well thought out and strategic effort to think through what are the supply chains, including in emerging industries that we are most interested in from a strategic and economic perspective, and how to engage. with those, from an investment perspective, but also to facilitate trade across the hemisphere in these goods, adding value in a way that we can and China cannot. And then, beyond that, finding ways to work on, digitalization, on digital economy development.
I want to get one other question. I very
Sure.
much like your focus on adding value, and I think Senator Young and I have talked about that over the years a little bit with respect to competitiveness. If you could flesh out how we might have a bipartisan provision in that area, in a China competitiveness package that would talk about how we could better add value to American goods and services and better compete, I think that'd be good. Senator Young and Senator Cornyn will get a visit from me on that. Mr. Chairman, can I ask one other question real quickly?
No, yes, sure. You can.
Cuba. Question for you, Mr. Harrington. I recently traveled to Cuba, and I was struck by how many private sector entrepreneurs there do not agree with the government, policies that have inhibited them. And what these folks said is, go back and tell your legislators in the United States Senate, I'm not going to mention any names, but they said, go back and tell your legislators that we really believe in private enterprise. We don't agree with the Cuban government on this. And if you all, Senator Wyden, will do more to encourage U.S. licensing agreements and banking, all of them said to a person, Mr. Senator, just see if I can have easier banking. Because if I can bank and my relatives can bank, we'll get more private enterprise here in Cuba. And then they delivered, I thought, the selling point I'd say to my colleagues. They said, you do something like this, Senator Wyden, and that will reduce Cuban migration from Cuba to the United States. It'll be good for business, and it will reduce migration. So I proposed this to the Biden administration. I never give up, but how can you all help us with this administration to unleash private enterprise in Cuba with things like very narrow approaches with licensing and banking around the idea that this will be a much-needed competitive orientation for the Cuban economy, and it will be good for reducing migration from Cuba to the United States. What can you all do?
Thank you very much, Senator Wyden. Thank you for leading that delegation. What it did was I think it really shone some light on really these important issues here in Washington. For those who don't know, the Chamber for more than 2 decades has promoted engagement with Cuba. We've opposed the Helms-Burton Act. And one of the key reasons that Senator Wyden mentions that we're in this is to empower the Cuban people, to break the shackles from a despotic regime, to be able to, because we firmly believe in the virtuous circle of free enterprise and democracy. We really believe that creating jobs, creating free enterprise creates democracy. I think in this case, there are a lot of recommendations that you've made. I've seen them. Restoring U-turn transactions, certainly pushing OFAC to allow U.S. banks to be able to operate on the island. And then there's the other smaller things like pushing up remittance thresholds, increasing travel license categories and availability. Individually, these are small measures. There's no doubt about that, as I think you indicated. Collectively, they're big because what they do is these all can provide sources of revenue to not only Cuban entrepreneurs, but Cubans that are facing the worst economic crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union. 2 things, very quickly. One thing that Congress can do, I believe, is push the Biden administration to call for a review of Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terror. Why is that so important? Because exactly to your point, when all these entrepreneurs are telling you they need financing, this designation, I can read through the long list of the legalities, and I won't do that. What it does is it creates that uncertainty that I was talking about before for any bank, not just in the US, but around the world that does business in the US, to have any business in Cuba. So that's one thing. Second thing, what we can do We're already contemplating a mission in the fall to work specifically with entrepreneurs on capacity building issues like starting a business, payroll, accounting, dealing with taxes, marketing, social media, et cetera. We have floated the idea to the interagency. We very much like the Commerce Department to participate, and we'd love to have you as part of
We'll
it too.
follow up with you. I'm way over my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Cornyn.
Senator Cornyn, your turn. Thanks. That was a great exchange. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chairman. Really got a lot on your plate today. Thanks. John.
Mr. Harrington, we've seen in a growing trend of nationalization of private resources, private enterprise, including minerals and energy, and we saw that in Mexico with, I think it's Vulcan Materials, among others. In Chile, President Boric announced his intention to nationalize the country's lithium industry. These trends created an unstable environment, to be sure, for U.S. investment in the region. What action should we take to counter this growing trend?
I think a case-by-case basis is important. I think in the Chilean case, Senator, first of all, it's a question that's on our minds all the time. In the case of Chile, I think we need to give some time for this to play out. Why? Because President Boric has in the past, despite the fact he's pursuing a quite left-leaning agenda, has been quite pragmatic in the past. So I think we would exercise caution there. On the case of Mexico, however, we have a trade agreement in the USMCA, as you referenced well in your opening remarks, that where frankly we're not holding our trade partners accountable for lack of compliance. And it starts with Mexico. And it starts with, obviously, the mining law that you referenced is the latest. The Vulcan incident was tantamount to expropriation. Investment protection in USMCA, it was limited, as you know, was trimmed down from NAFTA. Thankfully, Vulcan is able to use NAFTA to bring an ISDS case. In the case, but USTR in the case of energy, Mexico specifically, I think we've been, the last stat I'll give is that we have, the US had the right after 90 days, the US asked for energy consultations last July. After 90 days, the US had the right, US and Canada had the right to take Mexico to a dispute panel. Here we are 10 months later, and nothing has happened. There's a lot of talk, but no action. And so I would urge the Senate and the Congress to please ask USTR to enforce USMCA.
Ms. Myers, there's no secret that the PRC is a large provider of precursor chemicals that are used by the cartels in Mexico and elsewhere to produce synthetic opioids. Last year alone in America, 71,000 Americans died because they ingested fentanyl, which, as you know, is incredibly powerful, taking only the tip of a pencil lead worth of fentanyl to take a life. And of course, then the cartels use industrial size pill presses to gin out tens of thousands of these counterfeit pharmaceuticals, which people take, kids take, thinking it's something relatively innocuous, like a Percocet or a Xanax, only to not wake up the next morning. We know that we know where it's coming from, and we know where the precursors are coming from. We know where the manufactured drugs are coming from. The U.S. ambassador to China recently stated that the Chinese Communist Party is, quote, not contributing, close quote, to the U.S. fentanyl crisis, which I find bewildering. We know China is a virtual police state, and they monitor the movement of all their citizens. They have all sorts of ways of, through facial recognition and other other use of artificial intelligence to monitor the movements of their people and their businesses. Do you agree with the U.S. Ambassador to China that the CCP is not contributing to the fentanyl crisis in the United States?
I do not agree. The evidence very strongly suggests that China is not only involved in the production of precursors for meth and synthetic opioids, but also in laundering money for major supplier cartels. So there is, in fact, a profound involvement. And we have seen, previously a considerable effort, many years ago, frankly, to try to work with the U.S. to address some of these problems, and do so acknowledging that this is, in fact, a problem. Since the the China-U.S. relationship has soured very considerably, there has been less of an effort on the part of China's leadership to engage on this critical issue. It is exceedingly unfortunate. And I hope will change in the coming years, because until it does, China is implicit in this problem, and in fact, by extension, in the major challenges that we are facing, and in the unnecessary deaths of so many U.S. citizens.
I agree. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cornyn. We're coming close to the end. I thank you for sticking with us, and I want to again thank Senator Cornyn and his staff and my staff for pulling us all together, and thank you all for taking time. And again, our guests sitting out there in the cheap seats, we're happy that you could all join us. It's great to see you. Bienvenido. I've had the opportunity to be on CODELs to Central America, South America, North Mexico I've been in the Senate for 22 years. I've been going down there for almost that long, and continue to be hugely interested in that part of the world. They're our neighbors, and our success as a nation is largely interdependent with that of the folks who live south of us. In almost every CODEL I've been a part of, we've talked a fair amount about education, access to education. If countries are going to be lifted up, they're going to be lifted up because the citizens, especially the young people of those countries, get a better education. And the same is true here. The same is true here. So it's not just something that's on them. But a question, if I could, with respect to education, workforce development. During the CODEL I led, the bipartisan, bicameral CODEL I led earlier this year to Mexico, to Honduras, Guatemala, is a key message that we heard almost at every stop along the way was the need for improving access to education. This is not all on us, as you know, and earlier I referred to Home Depot. You can do it, we can help. This is not something that we can do for them, should we do for them by ourselves, but it's a shared responsibility, and we can help. But many of you are likely familiar with the proverb. There's another proverb: if you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day. If you teach a person to fish, that person can feed themselves and their families for a lifetime. I used to think that was in the scripture. I thought it was in the Bible. And I've quoted it for years and said, I'm not sure where this is in the Bible, but and then I would quote it. And about a year ago, after an event was over, and a fellow came up to me, he was a minister, and he said, when you quoted, you said, give a person a fish and you can feed him for a day, fit to teach a person to fish. He said, when you said that, and you said it was in the Bible, I said, yes. He said, it's not in the Bible. So, well, I said, it should be. It should be. But one of the most impactful ways to improve lives and to uplift entire countries is by better ensuring that the people there, young people and not so young people, have access to the education and workforce training that's needed to support themselves and their families, and actually the kind of workforce that's needed by employers in those particular countries. Question, if I can, I want to pick on Ms. Feingold and then maybe Mr. Harrington, but give us some ideas, some thoughts that you have on what can be done to further expand education and workforce development throughout Central and South America, and how can government officials and private sector leaders work together to advance this goal. This is sort of the you can do it, and then we'll figure out how we can help, please. Ms. Feingold, would you go first?
Thanks so much for the question, Senator. I think this is a great moment to be connecting the dots about what we've discussed today. For example, if we don't have, if you were talking about market access earlier, we do have investment through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, for example. And if you're going to be investing in infrastructure in the region or doing, that would be a perfect moment to do some workforce development training. We have models here in the labor movement. The labor movement next to the military is the largest provider of apprenticeship programs. I think we could do fantastic exchanges. We were talking about that earlier. We need to do some worker-to-worker exchanges. In our labor movement, we have lots of leaders from the Central American region who have natural connections back to Central America, back to the region, back to Mexico and throughout South America. So I think we could really harness the experience we have on apprenticeship. I want to just point out one thing that we've heard a lot about sort of the business environment, but one thing we really need to do in the region is to build trust. There is a lot of distrust over the years, and I hear it from our partners in the unions there. And I think educational programs, workforce development, apprenticeship, and one part of apprenticeship programs that's key is making sure they have the right to join a union. When we think about giving workers the right not to migrate, a great project that we've looked at the difference between workers who have a collective bargaining agreement in the apparel sector in Honduras. They are far more likely to have good working conditions, not be eager to leave their job because they feel like they can talk to the company, there's room for negotiation, they have good wages, and so we need to think about those kinds of models. That's what apprenticeship would do, worker-to-worker exchanges. We've been saying we'd love to do this, so we'd love to work with all of you to make that happen, especially in the critical mineral sector. That's another area where we think we could have some worker-to-worker exchanges. Workers are looking for a new economic model in the region, not just the old extractive model. How can we show them what a clean energy transition looks like? And I think, again, our unions are on the forefront of creating good union jobs in the clean energy sector and could provide that kind of information.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful, wonderful thoughts and comments. Mr. Harrington, please.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. This is something we've done previously in Mexico specifically, in the workforce development space. And I come at this humbly by saying I know nothing, but our companies know a lot. So we really look to our member companies, all of which have their own singular workforce development plans. And the reason I say they know the best, obviously, is they're trying to reskill, upskill their workers for an economy that's never moved faster, that's never transformed faster. And so a quick recommendation I'd have, if there's an appetite for it, is we'd be happy to, as the chamber, to jump in on a public-private endeavor for this, to get a collection of companies together that can help with this in the region.
Good, thank you. Senator Young was here, and you asked a question. We very much welcome his participation, not just today, but more broadly. He's been very active in these issues for some time. And I want to thank him also for working with me to advance digital trade policies like those in USMCA. And I hope we can bring some of those policies to the entire hemisphere and a lot of the places we're talking about here today. I have a comment or two as we conclude the hearing. Let me yield to Senator Cornyn for anything else that he would like to say. Okay. I want to again thank all of you for taking time to join us. This is, as it turns out, it's not just important stuff. This is stuff I really care about. I know Senator Cornyn does. I know Senator Cassidy do, and Senator Young, folks that were the Senator Wyden, and others who came here. We're competing. For your information, against a lot of other hearings that are going on, including one highly classified hearing that's going on at this moment that members feel compelled to attend, and we're going to go to immediately. But despite that, we had pretty darn good attendance and really a good conversation. To those that are here as guests, they're sitting in the audience, that maybe not been to many committee hearings of late. We don't always get along this well in our hearings, but that's when Senator Cornyn and I are involved in it, we do. And but we try to set a good example, and we believe that bipartisan solutions generally turn out to be lasting solutions. But my thanks to Senator Cornyn and his staff, my staff, for all that you did to bring us together for a really important conversation on economic cooperation across the Western Hemisphere in which we live. I want to thank again each of our witnesses for appearing before our subcommittee today. Some of we know, some of you don't. So it was a great chance to see some young friends and to make maybe some new ones. Thank you for lending your voice and expertise on how our country can further engage with our partners on trade and partners on investment in this region. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 7 hours from right now. No, actually, it's 7 days from right now. And our witnesses will have 45 days, that's a long time, 45 days to respond to the questions for the record that we send your way. Anything else? With that, I think we're adjourned. And as we say in Delaware, hasta pronto. Hasta pronto. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. We're adjourned. Thanks.